The letter came on a Tuesday, wedged between a fabric supplier's invoice and a magazine I'd forgotten I subscribed to, and I almost didn't open it at all that afternoon. I remember exactly where I was standing, at the reception desk of my own design studio, keys still in one hand, coffee going cold in the other, when I saw the return address: Whitfield and Combs, Attorneys at Law, Portland, Oregon. I had never heard of the firm. I had never heard the name Eleanor Whitfield in my life, and yet something about the careful, formal cream envelope made my stomach tighten in a way that junk mail never does. My name is Renee Hartley, and I was 38 years old when that letter arrived and quietly rearranged everything I thought I understood about my own history. But to explain why that letter mattered so much, why it landed on me the way it did, with the force of something I'd apparently been waiting my whole life without knowing it, I need to take you back 30 years, to a small house outside Eugene and a woman named Diane, who remarried when I was 5 years old. My mother was 26 when my biological father left, before I was old enough to remember his face, and by the time I was 5, she'd married a man named Gordon Voss, a contractor with his own construction and design firm, and a 9-year-old son named Marcus, who would grow up to become, without question, the most important person in that household for the next 3 decades. I don't say that with bitterness anymore, though I certainly felt it for most of my life. I say it because it's simply, factually true, and understanding it is the only way the rest of this story makes any sense. Gordon was not cruel to me, not in the dramatic, storybook way that makes for easy villains. He was something quieter, and in some ways more corrosive. Indifferent in the specific manner of a man who had absorbed a new family into his life without ever fully deciding to make room for all of it. Marcus got the corner bedroom with the good light. I got the smaller room down the hall that used to be a sewing room with a window that faced the neighbor's fence instead of the yard. Marcus got driving lessons from Gordon himself, patient weekend afternoons in the church parking lot. I learned to drive from a rental car pamphlet and my mother's nervous, distracted instruction in a school parking lot on Sunday mornings, because Gordon was too busy, which somehow was never true when it came to Marcus. I want to tell you about the specific moment I understood as a teenager exactly where I stood in that house, because I think it explains everything that came after. I was 16, and I'd spent an entire summer redesigning our cramped, outdated kitchen for a school project, measuring cabinet dimensions, sketching layouts, researching materials, building an actual scale model of cardboard and balsa wood that took me nearly 3 weeks of after-school afternoons. I brought it downstairs genuinely proud, hoping, the way 16-year-olds hope with their whole unguarded chest, that someone might actually look at it. Gordon glanced at it for maybe 4 seconds before turning back to the television. "Cute," he said, in the exact tone you'd use for a child's finger painting, and that was the entirety of his response. My mother said it was very creative, honey, already halfway back to the dishes. Marcus, 17 at the time, and mostly absent from my life except when it was convenient for him, actually laughed, not cruelly, just carelessly, the laugh of someone who'd never once had to wonder whether his efforts would be taken seriously. I kept that cardboard model in my closet for years afterwards. I still have it, actually, packed carefully in a box in my studio's storage room, because I think some part of me always understood, even at 16, that the thing I loved had existed before anyone in that house decided it didn't matter. There's another memory from around that same period that I think about often, maybe even more than the kitchen model, because it involves the one person in that house who occasionally, unpredictably, made me feel like I mattered. My grandmother, on my mother's side, Iris, who lived 2 towns over and would sometimes take me for weekend visits when things at home felt particularly unbearable. Iris never had much money, and she certainly never had Gordon's easy financial generosity towards whichever child he'd decided deserved it that season, but she had something else instead: an unshakable habit of actually looking at whatever I brought to show her, turning it over in her hands, asking real questions instead of offering the distracted, half-present praise I'd grown used to at home. "You've got an eye for space, Renee," she told me once, examining a floor plan I'd sketched for a treehouse I never actually got to build because Gordon decided the backyard budget that year was better spent on a basketball hoop for Marcus. Not everybody's got that. Don't let anybody talk you out of trusting it. Iris passed away when I was 19, in my first year of college, and I remember feeling like I was burying one of the only people who had ever actually seen me clearly, a feeling I wouldn't fully understand the strange, echoing significance of until nearly 20 years later, sitting in a law office learning about an entirely different grandmother who'd apparently been watching from a distance the whole time, unable to reach me the way Iris had been free to. If you've ever poured your whole heart into something as a kid, only to watch it land with a shrug from the people who were supposed to celebrate you, I made this story with you in mind. If you enjoy stories where truth eventually finds its way, consider subscribing to Silent Victory Stories. There's a lot more of this kind of story ahead, and I'd genuinely love to have you along for it. I went to college for interior architecture, paid for almost entirely through scholarships and a part-time job at a fabric warehouse, because Gordon had made it clear, without ever quite saying it outright, that college funding in our household flowed toward Marcus's business degree first and toward whatever was left over for me second. I didn't resent the scholarship hustle at the time. If anything, it made me sharper, hungrier, more determined to prove something I couldn't yet name. What I did resent, though I didn't have the language for it until much later, was watching Gordon fund an entire semester of Marcus's networking trip to Chicago the same year my financial aid office nearly dropped me for a $200 shortfall nobody in my family offered to help cover. After graduation, Gordon offered me a position at Voss Construction and Design, not out of generosity, I'd come to understand, but because a family firm with an actual licensed interior designer on staff looked good to clients, and because, frankly, my labor was cheaper than hiring someone from outside the family. I took the job anyway, 23 years old, and still naively hopeful that proving myself inside the family business would finally earn me the recognition I'd been quietly chasing since that cardboard kitchen model. For 4 years, I designed nearly every residential interior that firm produced: kitchen renovations, full home remodels, 2 boutique hotel lobbies that ended up featured in a regional design magazine. I was good at it. I knew I was good at it, in the quiet, private way you know something about yourself that nobody around you has bothered to confirm out loud. And for 4 years, every single one of those projects went out under Marcus's name as lead designer, because Gordon believed, and said so directly to my face more than once, that clients trusted a Voss name on the paperwork more than a Hartley name. And since Marcus was technically the project manager, it only made sense for him to take primary credit. The moment that finally broke something loose in me happened at the unveiling of that boutique hotel lobby, the one that ended up in the magazine. I stood at the back of a small gathering of clients and local press, watching Marcus field questions about his creative vision for a design I'd sketched alone late at night over 3 weeks of unpaid overtime, while he'd been in Cabo for his girlfriend's birthday. A reporter asked him what inspired the reclaimed wood accent wall, a detail I'd chosen specifically after visiting a salvage yard on my own time, on my own dime, because I'd had a very particular image in my head that I couldn't fully explain to anyone until I saw the wood in person. Marcus answered smoothly, effortlessly, some vague story about channeling the Pacific Northwest's relationship with reclaimed materials, and I watched an entire room nod along, charmed, while I stood at the edge of it holding a glass of warm champagne, utterly invisible in the middle of my own work. I gave my 2 weeks' notice the following Monday. Gordon seemed almost bewildered by the decision, as though it hadn't occurred to him that I might eventually want something more than quiet erasure in exchange for a paycheck. My mother, when I told her, asked if I was sure this was the responsible choice, which I understood even then as her particular way of saying she didn't fully believe I could survive without them, and possibly didn't fully believe I deserved to try. I started Hartley Design Studio 11 days later, with $4,000 in savings, a laptop, and a portfolio of work that legally, on paper, still credited someone else's name. I know this next part of Renee's life took real nerve, and I'd genuinely love to hear from you. Have you ever had to walk away from something familiar, even when it scared you, because staying had finally become worse than leaving? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. Act 2. The business I built without them. I won't pretend the first 2 years of Hartley Design Studio were anything but brutal. I worked out of my apartment's second bedroom, took on small residential clients Voss Construction wouldn't have bothered with, and spent more nights than I can count doing my own bookkeeping at 2 in the morning because I couldn't yet afford to hire anyone to do it for me. There were months I genuinely wondered if I'd made a catastrophic mistake, walking away from a steady paycheck, however humiliating the terms of that paycheck had been. I remember one client in particular from that first year, a retired school teacher named Ruth who hired me to redesign her small kitchen after her husband passed away on a budget so modest I nearly turned the project down out of simple financial necessity. I took it anyway, partly because I needed the work, but mostly because Ruth reminded me, in some hard-to-articulate way, of the version of myself that had once built a cardboard kitchen model nobody in my family had bothered to look at properly. I spent almost as many unpaid hours on that project as I did paid ones, sourcing discount materials, calling in favors from contractor friends I'd made during my Voss years, determined to give her something that felt intentional rather than cheap. When the kitchen was finished, Ruth stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking it in, before she started to cry. Nobody's ever built anything just for me before, not like this, not paying attention to what I actually needed. I drove home that night with considerably less money than the job should have earned me, and considerably more certainty than I had in months that I'd made the right choice walking away from Voss Construction. Ruth referred me to her book club, her church group, and eventually her entire extended family over the following 2 years, and I've always thought of that kitchen as the true first brick in whatever I eventually built, long before the magazine features or the design awards made it feel official to anyone watching from the outside. But something happened, slowly, almost without me noticing at first. Word of mouth started working in my favor. A kitchen renovation for a young couple led to a referral for their neighbor's whole house remodel, which led to a small write-up in a local lifestyle blog, which led 18 months in to my very first magazine feature, under my own name this time, no ambiguity, no shared credit, just Renee Hartley listed as the sole designer of a mid-century remodel that ended up winning a regional design award the following spring. I remember calling my mother the week that award was announced, some old, stubborn part of me still hoping, even after everything, that this might finally be the moment she'd sound proud without qualification. She congratulated me, briefly, before pivoting almost immediately to an update about Marcus's engagement party, and I hung up the phone in my empty apartment, feeling the specific, hollow ache of realizing that no accomplishment, no matter how significant, was ever going to compete with simply being Gordon's biological son. I stopped waiting for that particular validation somewhere around year 4 of running my own studio, not because I stopped wanting it exactly, but because I finally understood that continuing to wait for it was its own kind of self-erasure. I threw myself into the business instead, hired my first employee, then my third, then my 7th, expanded from residential into small boutique commercial projects, built a reputation, slowly and honestly, as someone whose name on a project meant something specific and dependable. By the time I turned 36, Hartley Design Studio had 14 employees, a small but well-regarded portfolio of hospitality and residential projects across the Pacific Northwest, and a level of financial stability I genuinely hadn't allowed myself to imagine back when I was doing my own books at 2 in the morning.
I bought a modest but genuinely mine house in a quiet neighborhood outside Portland. I was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of quiet, self-made success story nobody in my family had ever predicted, and certainly nobody had helped build. There's one particular turning point I want to tell you about from around year 5, because it taught me something about myself I hadn't fully understood before. I'd taken on a difficult client, a restaurant owner named Theo who'd fired 2 previous designers before coming to me, notorious in the local business community for being nearly impossible to satisfy. 6 weeks into the project, after a brutal round of revisions on the dining room layout, Theo told me flatly in front of his entire management staff that he didn't think I understood what real hospitality design required, and that he was seriously considering ending our contract. The old version of myself, the one who'd spent 4 years watching Marcus take credit for her work without saying a word, would have absorbed that criticism quietly, apologized reflexively, maybe even discounted my fee to keep the peace. Instead, I asked Theo for 15 minutes, uninterrupted, and I walked him through every single decision in that layout, the sightlines to the open kitchen, the acoustic panels disguised as art installations, the specific traffic flow calculated from 3 weeks of watching his existing restaurant during dinner service. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't apologize for taking up the room's attention. I simply explained clearly and completely exactly why the work was correct. Theo went quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "He's never actually walked me through it like that before," he said. "Everyone else just gets defensive or folds." That restaurant became one of my studio's most successful early showcases, and Theo referred 4 more clients to me over the following 2 years, and I've always thought of that kitchen as the true first brick in whatever I eventually built, long before the magazine features or the design awards made it feel official to anyone watching from the outside. My relationship with my mother during those years settled into something distant but functional: occasional phone calls, obligatory holiday visits, a careful mutual avoidance of anything that might reopen old wounds neither of us fully knew how to address. Gordon and I spoke perhaps twice a year. Marcus and I barely spoke at all beyond the polite, empty prelatures required at family gatherings neither of us particularly wanted to attend. It was into this quiet, hard-won stability that the certified letter arrived on any other unremarkable Tuesday afternoon and unraveled 38 years of assumptions I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. I opened the envelope at my reception desk, my reception manager Priya hovering nearby with a question about fabric samples that suddenly felt entirely unimportant. Inside was a formal letter, embossed letterhead, addressed directly to me. "Dear Miss Hartley, this letter is to inform you that you have been named as the sole primary beneficiary in the estate of the late Eleanor Whitfield, who passed away on the 14th of last month. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss the terms of the estate, which include real property, financial assets, and a personal letter that Mrs. Whitfield specifically requested be delivered only in person upon your visit to our office." I read that paragraph 4 times before the words fully settled into any coherent meaning. I had never, to my knowledge, met anyone named Eleanor Whitfield. I certainly had never expected to inherit anything from a stranger, let alone a stranger significant enough to leave behind real property and a personal letter with specific delivery instructions. "Everything okay?" Priya asked, watching my face carefully.
"I genuinely have no idea," I told her honestly, which turned out to be one of the truest things I'd say for the next several weeks. I called the number on the letterhead that same afternoon and spoke to a paralegal who confirmed, patiently, that yes, this was a legitimate estate matter, and yes, they would need me to come into their Portland office in person at my earliest convenience to review the full details. She wouldn't, or perhaps legally couldn't, tell me anything further over the phone about who Eleanor Whitfield actually was, or why she'd apparently known enough about me to name me directly in a legal document. I called my mother that evening, half expecting she might have some immediate explanation, some distant family friend or old employer I'd forgotten. Instead, there was a pause on the line long enough that I actually checked to see if the call had dropped. "Mom, did you hear me? The name is Eleanor Whitfield." "I heard you," she said, and something in her voice had changed entirely, flattened, careful, the voice of someone choosing each word with unusual precision. "I don't recognize the name, Renee. I'm sure it's some kind of administrative mix-up. These things happen sometimes with estates." I might have believed her if I hadn't spent 38 years learning to hear the specific difference between my mother's honest confusion and my mother's careful management of a conversation she didn't want to continue. This was unmistakably the latter, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I found myself unwilling to simply let it go. "Mom," I said slowly, "is there something you're not telling me?" The pause this time was even longer. "We'll talk about it when you know more," she said finally, which was, I would come to understand within the week, as close to an admission as I was ever going to get from her over the phone. I scheduled my appointment with Whitfield and Combs for the following Thursday, and I spent the days leading up to it in a strange, low-grade state of unease I couldn't quite name. Not dread, exactly, but the specific anticipatory tension of standing at the edge of something you already sense is going to shape the shape of everything behind you. We're getting close to the part of this story where everything finally comes together, and I promise it's worth the wait. Stay with me a little longer. Margaret Combs, the attorney handling Eleanor Whitfield's estate, was a composed woman in her 50s with the specific unhurried steadiness I would come to appreciate deeply over the following hour. Her office was smaller and warmer than I'd expected from the formal letterhead, soft lamplight instead of harsh fluorescence, a worn leather chair across from her desk that had clearly hosted a great many difficult conversations before mine. "Thank you for coming in, Miss Hartley." She opened a folder on her desk. "I want to start by telling you a little about Eleanor because I think it will help everything that follows make more sense." I nodded, hands folded tightly in my lap. Eleanor Whitfield was 79 when she passed. She was a retired architect, well respected in Portland's design community for nearly 50 years. In fact, I understand, she followed your career with real interest over the past several years, particularly after your studio's award-winning remodel was featured regionally. "She knew about my work?" I said, something in my chest tightening unexpectedly. "She knew a great deal about your work," Margaret said gently. "Because, Miss Hartley, Eleanor Whitfield was your paternal grandmother." I sat very still, the words not quite landing correctly. "I don't have a paternal grandmother," I said slowly. "My biological father left when I was a baby. I never knew his family." "Your biological father was Daniel Whitfield," she said, watching my face carefully, clearly gauging exactly how much I could absorb at once. "He was Eleanor's only son. He died in a car accident when you were 18 months old, not long after your mother says he left, as I understand the family's account of things. Eleanor didn't learn of your existence nearly 2 years after that, when she tracked down some old correspondence between your father and your mother. By the time she reached out, your mother had already remarried and made it very clear that she did not want Eleanor involved in your life." I felt the room tilt slightly, the careful architecture of my entire childhood rearranging itself in real time. "My mother knew about her," I said slowly, "this whole time. She knew this woman existed, knew she wanted contact with me, and she never told me." "I can't speak to your mother's reasoning," Caddy said carefully. "What I can tell you is that Eleanor tried repeatedly over the years. Birthday cards, letters, at least 2 attempts to visit in person when you were young, and every attempt was returned or declined.
Eventually, on the advice of her own family lawyer at the time, she stepped back, believing it might do more harm than good to keep pushing against your mother's clear wishes. But she never stopped watching, quietly from a distance. When your design work started appearing in local press, she recognized your name immediately, and she followed your career closely for the better part of a decade, though she chose never to contact you directly again, out of respect for boundaries she'd been told to honor, even though I don't believe she ever agreed with them. "What exactly did she leave me?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected, though everything underneath it felt anything but. Margaret consulted the folder in front of her. The primary asset is her home in Portland's historic district, appraised at just under $1 million, along with an investment portfolio valued at approximately $400,000. There's also a smaller separate account, roughly $60,000, that she specifically designated as unrestricted. Her note in the files says it's meant, in her words, for whatever Renee decides matters, without anyone else's opinion attached to it. I let out a short, involuntary laugh at that last detail, because it was so precisely, uncannily aligned with the exact kind of independence I'd spent my entire adult life fighting to claim for myself. "She really did pay attention," I said quietly, more to myself than to Margaret. "She kept detailed files of your career for nearly a decade," Margaret said, not unkindly. "I've handled a great many estates in my career, Miss Hartley, and I can tell you honestly, I don't think I've seen anyone track a person's accomplishments with the kind of devoted, careful attention Eleanor gave to yours. Whatever else was true about the circumstances that kept the two of you apart, I don't think there's any question that she loved you consistently for the entirety of your life." I sat in that worn leather chair and cried, quietly, for the fourth time in a story I hadn't yet realized was still being written. Not from grief, exactly. I'd never known Eleanor Whitfield, couldn't grieve a person I had no memory of, but from something more disorienting, the sudden vertiginal understanding that somewhere out there, for nearly 40 decades, a woman had been quietly, persistently proud of me, had watched my career unfold from a careful distance, had wanted to know me, while the family who actually raised me had spent that same decade treating my success as an inconvenient surprise. "There's a personal letter, Jackie," she said gently, once I'd steadied myself. "Eleanor was very specific that it be given to you here, in person, rather than mailed." She handed me a cream envelope, my name written across the front in a careful, old-fashioned hand I had never seen before and somehow, impossibly, recognized as belonging to me. The same particular slant to the letters, the same distinctive curve on the capital R that I'd seen in my own handwriting my entire life without ever understanding where it came from. If you've ever discovered something about your own family that reframed everything you thought you understood about yourself, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Not to compare stories, just because I think there's something powerful in naming these things out loud together. I read Eleanor's letter alone in my car in the law office parking lot, the same way I would realize much later that another woman in another story might once have sat reading a letter from her own father in a different parking lot entirely, some quiet, private ritual of grief and revelation that apparently belongs to anyone who's ever inherited more truth than they were prepared for.
My dear Renee, I never had the chance to know you, and that is the deepest regret of my life, deeper even than losing my son. I want you to know that I tried, more times than you'll ever know, and that every single attempt was made with love, not obligation. I understood, eventually, that pushing harder against your mother's wishes might have hurt you more than it helped, and so I stepped back, though it broke something in me to do it. What I never stopped doing was watching. I have every article, every magazine feature, every small mention of Hartley Design Studio in a folder in my study, going back nearly 10 years. I want you to know that I have been, from a distance, one of the proudest people alive of everything you've built entirely on your own, with no help from anyone who should have given it to you freely. This house, this money, this life I'm leaving behind, none of it is meant to replace the relationship we never got to have. It's simply meant to say, as plainly as I know how, you were loved by more people than you ever knew, even when it didn't reach you in time to matter. I'm sorry it took my death to finally say so. Please don't let anyone make you feel like an accident. You were the most wanted person in this story. You just weren't told. I sat in that parking lot for nearly 40 minutes before I trusted myself to drive, and when I finally got home, I called my mother and asked her, directly, to tell me the truth, the whole truth, without careful management, without pivoting to some other subject the moment things became uncomfortable. She was quiet for a long time on the phone before she finally spoke. "Your father and I were together for almost 2 years," she said. "It wasn't some brief, shameful thing, Renee, whatever you might be imagining. I loved him, but he died before we ever got married, before I even told him I was pregnant with you. And I was 24 years old, terrified with a baby and no husband in a town where that still meant something people whispered about." "So you married Gordon instead," I said. "I married Gordon because he offered me stability, and because I genuinely believed, at the time, that giving you a two-parent household mattered more than keeping you connected to a grandmother I'd never actually met, who kept sending letters that made me feel like she thought I wasn't capable of raising you myself." "She wasn't trying to take me from you," I said. "She just wanted to know me." "I know that now," my mother said, and for the first time in the entire conversation, her voice cracked slightly, the careful management finally giving way to something rawer underneath. "I didn't know it then. I was so afraid of losing you to a family that had more money, more stability, more of everything I felt like I couldn't give you on my own, that I convinced myself cutting her off completely was protecting you instead of just protecting my own fear." I didn't forgive her in that conversation, not fully, not all at once, but I understood something I hadn't been able to access before, that my mother's silence hadn't been born from cruelty exactly, but from a fear so old and so deeply rooted that she'd never fully examined whether it was actually serving either of us. It didn't undo 38 years of feeling like an afterthought in her second marriage, but it gave me somewhere honest to stand while I figured out what came next. There was one more detail from that conversation I've thought about often since, one I almost didn't ask about, but I'm glad I did. "Did you ever read her letters?" I asked my mother, "the ones Eleanor sent over the years. Did you actually read them or just send them back unopened?" The silence on the line stretched long enough that I thought she might not answer at all. "I read the first few," admitted finally. "They were beautiful, Renee. She wrote about Daniel, your father, in a way that made him feel like a real person instead of just an absence. She wrote about wanting to know you, about having a room ready whenever you wanted to visit, no pressure, no expectations. I stopped reading them after a while because they made me feel like I was failing you by keeping her away, and it was easier to just stop opening them than to sit with that feeling." "You kept them, though," I said. It wasn't a question. Somehow I already knew. "They're in a box in my closet," my mother said quietly. "I never had the courage to throw them away, and I never had the courage to give them to you either. I think some part of me always knew this day might come, and I was just hoping it wouldn't happen while I was still around to answer for it." She mailed me that box the following week, nearly 20 years of unopened letters and cards, some still sealed, Eleanor's careful handwriting on every envelope, birthday wishes for ages I'd already long since passed by the time they arrived, addressed to a niece she'd never been allowed to actually know. I read through every single one over the course of a single long weekend, and by the end of it, I understood Eleanor Whitfield not just as a stranger who'd left me an inheritance,
but as a woman who had loved me faithfully, patiently, and entirely without reciprocation for nearly 40 decades. News travels strangely in small design communities, and within about 3 weeks of my visit to Whitefield and Combs, a local business journal ran a short item about Eleanor Whitefield's estate, mentioning in passing that the primary beneficiary was local designer Renee Hartley of Hartley Design Studio. I hadn't given anyone permission to publish that detail, and I never did find out exactly how the journalist got it, though I have my suspicions about a loose-lipped paralegal somewhere in that process. What I do know is that within 4 days of that article running, Gordon called me for the first time in over a year. "Renee," he said, his voice warmer than I'd heard him in decades, "we should have dinner, catch up properly. I feel like we've all drifted, and with everything you're going through right now, I want you to know your family's here for you." I nearly laughed out loud at the phone, the timing so transparent it almost would have been funny under different circumstances. "That's kind of you, Gordon," I said carefully. "What exactly prompted this?" "Can't a father just want to reconnect with his daughter?" he asked, and I noted with a specific kind of exhausted clarity that this was the first time in my entire life I could recall him referring to me as his daughter without some qualifying hesitation beforehand. Marcus reached out 2 days later, an even more transparent attempt, framed as excitement about a potential collaboration between Hartley Design Studio and Voss Construction, an opportunity, he suggested, for us to finally work together as equals, now that I'd apparently proven myself sufficiently. He mentioned, as an aside, that Voss Construction had been going through a rough patch lately and could really use a design partnership with a name people trusted. I understood with total clarity by that point exactly what all of this reconnection actually was. Not love rediscovered, not genuine pride finally surfacing after decades of indifference, but the specific, opportunistic warmth of people who had suddenly recalculated my value now that it came attached to a number they could see. I didn't respond with anger, though I certainly felt plenty of it simmering underneath. I responded instead with the kind of calm, unshakable clarity I'd spent the better part of a decade building, brick by brick, in a business that had never once needed their validation to succeed. "Gordon," I said, when he called a second time, "I appreciate the invitation, but I think we both know this isn't really about reconnecting. It's about an inheritance you read about in the newspaper. I'm not interested in pretending otherwise, and I'm not interested in a relationship that only activates when there's something to be gained from it." He sputtered something about being hurt by the accusation, which in its own way told me everything I needed to know. I told Marcus more simply that Hartley Design Studio wasn't interested in any partnership now or in the foreseeable future, and that I hoped Voss Construction found its way through whatever difficulties it was facing, sincerely, but separately from me. Gordon didn't let it rest there, though. 3 weeks after that phone call, he showed up unannounced at my studio on a Thursday afternoon, something he had never once done in the entire decade I'd been running the business. Priya buzzed him through with an apologetic look, and I met him in the small conference room off the main floor, keeping the conversation deliberately brief and professional.
"I think you're being unfair," he said, without preamble, settling into a chair he hadn't been invited to sit in. "This is your family, Renee. Whatever complicated history we've got, blood is blood." "That's an interesting thing for you to say," I told him, "given that it turns out we don't actually share any." Something in his face shifted, not quite guilt, but something adjacent to it, the specific discomfort of a man realizing the ground under a familiar argument had just been pulled away entirely. "That doesn't change 18 years of raising you," he said, quieter now. "No," I agreed, "it doesn't. But raising someone and actually seeing them aren't the same thing, Gordon, and you know exactly which one you did for me. If you'd come here to have an honest conversation about that, I'd have made time for it gladly, but you didn't come here for that. "You came here because Marcus's business is struggling, and a newspaper told me I might be able to fix it." He didn't have a response to that. He left a few minutes later, quieter than he'd arrived, and he hasn't shown up at my studio unannounced since. It wasn't a satisfying confrontation in the dramatic sense, no raised voices, no cathartic final word, but it was, I think, the most honest exchange the two of us had ever actually had, and something about its plainness felt more like justice than any argument ever could have. My mother, to her credit, didn't attempt anything similar. If anything, the conversation we'd had about Eleanor seemed to have shifted something quieter and more honest between us. Not a full repair, but the beginning of one, built on an actual reckoning rather than convenient timing. If any part of this, the sudden reappearance of people who overlooked you the moment your success became visible enough to benefit from, feels familiar, I hope watching Renee draw this particular line gives you something useful for your own life. Boundaries built on clarity, not anger, tend to hold the longest. Eleanor Whitfield's house turned out to be a beautiful, aging craftsman on a quiet street in Portland's historic district, filled with decades of architectural drawings, design journals, and, exactly as she described in her letter, an entire cabinet devoted to articles and clippings about Hartley Design Studio, carefully organized by year, going back almost 10 years. I spent an entire weekend alone in that house, going through box after box of a life I'd never gotten to know firsthand, and finding, in nearly every room, small evidence of a woman who had loved architecture and design with the exact same quiet intensity I'd carried my whole life without ever understanding where it came from. I didn't sell the house. I converted it, slowly, over the following year, into a second studio location for Hartley Design, a smaller, more intimate space specifically for mentoring young designers just starting out, the kind of support I'd never had access to myself at that stage of my career. I named the mentorship program after her, the Whitfield Design Fellowship, offering paid apprenticeships to young designers from backgrounds without the built-in advantages that had never been available to me either. The first fellow I brought on was a 22-year-old woman named Priya's younger cousin, sharp and talented and entirely unnoticed by the larger firms that had passed her over for candidates with more polished family connections. Watching her work in that converted studio surrounded by Eleanor's old drawings and journals felt like the most honest tribute I could offer a woman I'd never had the chance to actually meet. Her name was Sophia, and her first independent project through the fellowship was a small nonprofit community center on the east side of Portland, working with a fraction of the budget she'd need for anything comparable in a commercial setting. I watched her make the exact kind of resourceful, clever decisions I remembered making myself in those early years, repurposing salvaged materials, designing flexible spaces that could serve 3 different community functions in a single room, finding beauty in constraint rather than treating it as a limitation. When the center opened, the local paper ran a small feature on it, crediting Sophia by name as lead designer. No ambiguity, no shared credit with anyone who hadn't actually done the work. I kept a copy of that article. I don't entirely know why, except that some part of me understood, reading it, that I was watching a small correction ripple forward through time. Not just a repair of what I'd lost, but an active refusal to let the same erasure happen to someone else, simply because I now had the power to prevent it. Sophia has since gone on to lead 3 more projects through the fellowship, and I suspect within a few years she'll have outgrown anything I can teach her, which is exactly the outcome Eleanor's legacy was always meant to produce. My relationship with Gordon and Marcus has remained distant since that period, not hostile exactly, but honestly limited to what it's always actually been, without the pretense of a closeness that never really existed. My mother and I talk more now than we have in years, carefully, imperfectly, both of us learning a new way of being honest with each other after decades of practiced avoidance.
It isn't the relationship either of us wished we'd had all along, but it's real, built on truth instead of careful management, and given everything, that feels like more than I ever expected to get. I think about Eleanor's letter often, not the formal legal document Margaret Combs read to me in that office, but the private one, written in handwriting that somehow impossibly matched my own. You were the most wanted person in this story. You just weren't told. I've come to understand that as the truest thing anyone has ever said to me, and I try now to carry it the way she clearly intended, not as a wound reopened, but as permission finally granted to stop measuring my worth by the people who were slowest to recognize it. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever built something real while the people who were supposed to believe in you first stayed quiet, only to reappear once your success became visible enough to matter to them, I hope you'll stay with me for the next one. This channel exists because so many of you have written in about your own quiet victories, your own unexpected letters waiting somewhere down the line, and I read every single one of your comments. Take care of yourselves this week, and if there's someone quietly building something in your life right now, without much applause yet, tell them you see it. You never know how long they've been waiting to hear it. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.